The first sign something was wrong came when I got home from the hospital after a double shift and found the lock on my shed snapped clean off, the door hanging open like a busted jaw. I'm not exactly the paranoid type. I've been an ER nurse for 20 years, and I've seen what real emergencies look like, but this ticked me off in a way I hadn't felt since my divorce. I stepped into the shed and stopped cold. Everything was gutted. My pressure washer was gone. The generator I'd bought last year after the hurricane? Missing. Tools scattered everywhere, broken shelves, oil dumped across the floor like someone had thrown a tantrum. My grandfather's old workbench had been split down the middle, and the old photo of him I kept above it was crumpled in the corner. I knew exactly who did it. Candace, I muttered, gripping the broken lock in my hand. Candace Dillard, the HOA president. Middle-aged, power-hungry, and always 2 inches from a clipboard. She ran the Maple Hollow HOA like it was the Pentagon. She'd already fined me twice this year, once for leaving my trash bin out past noon, another time for unsightly weeds that were literally just wildflowers my daughter planted. I'd kept my head down, paid the ridiculous fines, and stayed clear. But this was war. I stormed back into my house, boots still muddy from the shed, and called the non-emergency police line. Officer Ruiz showed up about 20 minutes later, a guy I'd seen around town a few times. He looked over the damage, took some photos, and raised an eyebrow when I told him I suspected the HOA. "You got any proof?" "Not yet," I said, "but I've got security cams on the back porch. They don't cover the inside of the shed, but they face the backyard. Should have caught whoever came through." He nodded, then stepped aside as I pulled up the footage on my laptop. I fast-forwarded through the early morning stillness, and then there it was. 3 people. Middle of the day, broad daylight. They walked right into my backyard like they owned the place. One of them carried bolt cutters. I paused the video. "Right there," I said, pointing. "That's Candace. That's her stupid floral scarf. She wears it to every HOA meeting." Ruiz leaned in. "You sure?" "Oh, I'm sure." He wrote up the report, but told me unless I had footage of them actually trashing the inside of the shed, it might not stick. Trespassing, maybe. Damage? Might be tough. I didn't care. I wasn't playing defense anymore. The next day, I filed a report with the City Code Enforcement Office and called a lawyer I'd met back in nursing school, Wesley Rayner. He'd gone into property law. We hadn't talked in years, but he picked up on the second ring. "Wes, it's Camilla Dorsey. I've got a situation." My HOA broke into my shed. There was a pause. "Say that again?" "They trespassed. Damaged everything. I've got video. I want to hit them with everything I can." He didn't hesitate. "I'm in." Over the next week, Wesley helped me put together a case. He walked me through the HOA bylaws, highlighted half a dozen violations just from the trespassing alone. Turns out the HOA had no legal authority to enter private property unless there was a documented emergency or a court order. There was neither. And the best part? The bylaws specifically stated that individual board members could be held personally liable for unauthorized damage. I made copies of the footage. I cataloged every missing and broken item from the shed, documented cleanup costs, and even had Wesley help me file a cease and desist letter addressed to each member of the board. I also posted a sign on my shed: "Private property trespassers will be prosecuted." That's when Candace came knocking. It was Sunday morning, and I was sipping coffee on my porch when I saw her marching up the walkway like she was storming Normandy, clipboard in hand. Her lips were already pursed like she was ready to lecture a toddler. "Camilla," she said, voice syrupy. "We need to talk." "Do we?" I asked, not moving from my chair. "I'm afraid you've misunderstood what happened. The HOA was conducting a compliance check. There were reports your shed was harboring rodents." "Rodents?" I laughed. "You broke in with bolt cutters and trashed the place because of rodents?" "It was a necessary inspection. You're not pest control, Candace. You're not even code enforcement. You're a retired substitute teacher with control issues." Her nostrils flared. "I'm giving you the opportunity to settle this quietly. Take down the cease and desist and drop the claim. Otherwise, the board will have no choice but to issue further violations against your property. The weeds, the fence, the faded paint on the east side." I stood up. "You owe me over $7,000 in damages. You trespassed. You destroyed property. I've got video. And now you're trying to intimidate me into dropping it? That's a bonus charge, by the way, retaliation." Her eyes twitched, just slightly. She turned on her heel and walked off without another word. That night, I installed 2 more security cameras, one facing the front yard, the other aimed directly at the HOA community office across the street. By Monday, half the neighborhood had heard the story. Turns out, I wasn't the only one they'd harassed. My neighbor, Calvin, told me they fined him for having a non-regulation mailbox. The Thompsons got a notice for their Halloween decorations staying up past November 1st. A single mom down the street had been fined $300 because her kid's tricycle was left on the lawn. But nobody had fought back until now. Wesley filed a civil suit on my behalf, naming Candace and the other 2 board members as individual defendants. He also filed for a temporary restraining order to keep them off my property. The judge granted it in under 48 hours. The court date was set for 3 weeks out, but the fallout started immediately. Candace tried to send out a community-wide notice saying I was abusing the legal system. Wesley fired back with a cease and desist for defamation. Then, the local paper caught wind of the story. I didn't even have to call them, someone else tipped them off. The headline read, HOA board accused of trespassing and property destruction, resident fights back. And just like that, the board started unraveling. A week before the court date, I came home to find an anonymous envelope shoved under my front door. No return address. Inside were 5 printed emails. At first glance, they looked like minutes from an HOA board discussion. But the tone? Pure arrogance. The emails were between Candace and the other 2 board members, Gerald from Lot 17 and Naomi from the corner house with the fake ivy. They spoke candidly about forcing compliance on the more uncooperative properties and demonstrating consequences to those who challenged the board's authority. One email from Candace read, "She's a nurse. She doesn't have time to fight us in court. This'll set an example." I read the line again. Then again. My hands clenched the paper until it crinkled. Wesley showed up the next morning with a folder of exhibits and a tired smile. I handed him the envelope without a word. He read every page in silence, then looked up. "Where'd you get this?" "Someone slid it under my door." No note. They're toast. The next day, Wesley filed a motion to amend the complaint, adding conspiracy and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The judge approved it in under 24 hours. And that's when things really started to go downhill for them. I wasn't the only one who'd received a mysterious delivery. Calvin next door got a packet with copies of forged complaints the board had supposedly received about his property. The handwriting on them? Identical. Someone had been manufacturing violations to justify fines. Then Mrs. Callahan, a retired librarian who hadn't left her house in a month due to knee surgery, suddenly had a lien placed on her home for unpaid HOA dues. Problem was, her payments were automatically deducted, and the bank confirmed everyone had gone through on time. Wesley compiled everything into a supplemental filing. The pattern was clear. The HOA board had been leveraging fake inspections, fabricated violations, and even manipulating payment records to squeeze homeowners. That moved our case from civil misconduct into potential criminal fraud. I got a call from Detective Mallory 2 days later. Ruiz had passed the case up the chain after reviewing the footage and our mounting evidence. Mallory was calm, methodical, and asked all the right questions. She didn't say much at first, but I could tell she was interested. 2 days after that, the detective called again. This time, her tone had changed. "We pulled the HOA's financial records," she said. "There are discrepancies. Funds that don't match outgoing expenses. We're opening a formal investigation." I stared out my kitchen window. Across the street, the HOA office lights were still on. Candace's SUV was parked in the spot labeled President. I watched as she walked out, talking on her phone, pacing like someone who couldn't sit still for fear of what would catch up to them. The court date arrived on a gray Thursday morning. We filed into the small county courthouse, just 2 rows of benches, a cracked acoustic tile ceiling, and the faint smell of mildew. Candace showed up with a lawyer I recognized from TV ads, the kind who advertised aggressive defense and no win, no fee. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Brenner, wasted no time. Wesley laid out our case with surgical precision. He started with the footage of the trespass, then moved into the damage inventory, then the emails. When he reached the part about the forged complaints, the courtroom went dead silent. Candace's lawyer tried to argue that the emails were taken out of context. Brenner leaned forward. "Are you suggesting your client didn't write them?" "No, Your Honor. I'm saying." "Then context is irrelevant. The content speaks for itself." Then Brenner turned to Candace. Did you or did you not authorize entry onto the plaintiff's property without notice or consent? Candace's mouth opened, but no words came out. Answer the question. I believed we had the right, she finally muttered. You believed incorrectly. Under Civil Code Section 522, your board requires either emergency justification or legal access granted by the homeowner. You had neither. Wesley handed over our final exhibit, a notarized statement from the HOA's former treasurer. He'd stepped down the month before, but apparently couldn't stomach what the board had become. In his statement, he detailed how Candace had overruled normal vote procedures, signed checks without approval, and maintained a compliance list of residents she wanted handled. Brenner read every word. Then she looked up. I am issuing a court order requiring the immediate resignation of all current HOA board members. Additionally, I'm referring this case to the district attorney's office for review of potential criminal charges, including fraud and unlawful property damage. Candace's lawyer tried to object, but the judge cut him off. You're lucky I'm not holding your client in contempt. Candace sat frozen. Gerald looked like he was about to faint. Naomi pulled out her phone and started texting furiously, probably trying to salvage whatever was left of her reputation. By the time we walked out of that courtroom, word had already spread. A local reporter was waiting on the courthouse steps. I didn't say much, just confirmed the ruling and walked straight to my truck. That night, the Maple Hollow website went offline. The following morning, a notice went out to every homeowner. A special election would be held in 10 days to replace the entire HOA board. In the meantime, an independent property management company appointed by the court would handle operations. A few days later, Detective Mallory called again. We arrested Gerald this morning, she said. He'd been funneling fines into a private account. Naomi's being questioned. Candace's house was searched. We found a ledger. I didn't ask what was in the ledger. I didn't need to. The new board election was held in the community center. For the first time in years, turnout was massive. People who'd never even shown up to past meetings were now running for office. I nominated Calvin for president. He won in a landslide. They asked me to serve as vice president. I declined. I told them I was happy to help from the sidelines, but I'd had enough late nights dealing with disasters this time. I wanted to enjoy my neighborhood, not police it. Calvin stopped by my porch a week later, holding a clipboard and a grin. Guess what we voted on today, he said. What? We're dissolving the fine system. From now on, violations will be handled with written notices and 30-day grace periods. No more automatic penalties. I leaned back in my chair and let out a long breath. About time. And we approved a fund to help residents with repairs, especially seniors. Funded by the money the board embezzled. I raised an eyebrow. Recovered already? Most of it. Naomi flipped. She gave the DA everything. I stood and shook his hand. The shed still got scratches on the floor. A cracked shelf I never bothered to replace, but I kept it that way. A reminder. Not just of what happened, but of what it took to fix it. And of what happens when people stop being afraid. 3 weeks after the court ruling, my front yard was quieter than it had ever been. No daily patrol from clipboard-wielding board members. No paper threats tucked under my doormat. No passive-aggressive notices taped to my mailbox. It was almost eerie, like the whole neighborhood had exhaled after years of holding its breath. But the peace didn't last. It started with an email from Detective Mallory. She asked if I could stop by the precinct the next morning. No details, just that it was regarding new developments in the Maple Hollow investigation. I arrived early, still in scrubs from a night shift, and found her waiting with a man in a Navy suit who introduced himself as Assistant District Attorney Leonard Pike. He wasted no time. We've been examining the HOA's bank records more thoroughly. There's a discrepancy in the way certain fines were deposited and later withdrawn. Specifically, we're looking at funds that were never recorded in the HOA's annual budget but were collected from residents over the last 18 months. That sounds like what they were already doing, I said, arms crossed. Mallory slid a file across the table. This is worse. We believe Candace and Gerald used a shadow account registered under a shell nonprofit. It was listed as a community outreach fund. Residents were instructed to make checks out to the HOA, but the routing numbers led somewhere else. I flipped through the documents. There were payment slips, bank transfers, and a list of names. Dozens of them. People I saw every week, families, retirees, veterans forced to pay fines that never even reached the association's books. Pike leaned forward. We believe they embezzled over $41,000. And that's just what we've confirmed. It was like being hit with a second wave of betrayal. I'd thought the damage was done, the resignations, the civil case, the media exposure. But this was premeditated theft, not just of property, but of trust. Mallory pulled out a photo. Recognize this place? It was a warehouse off Route 19, about 20 minutes outside of town. I nodded. That's where Gerald's company used to store landscaping equipment, she said. We executed a search warrant 2 days ago. Found pallets of supplies, new mulch, paint, power tools, all purchased with HOA funds, none of which were ever used in the neighborhood. Pike added, we also found several boxes marked community improvement that were filled with unopened electronics. Tablets, routers, even a drone. Any idea what they were for? I asked. They were listed as security upgrades in last year's HOA budget, but not a single one was installed. I rubbed my face. So they were just buying tech with HOA money and keeping it? Or selling it, Mallory said. We're still tracing the serial numbers. By the time I left the precinct, I'd agreed to testify again, this time in a criminal trial. Candace, Gerald, and Naomi had all been indicted. The charges included wire fraud, conspiracy to embezzle, and unlawful misappropriation of community funds. The DA's office was pushing for felony convictions. The new board, led by Calvin, had their hands full. Every day brought a new mess to untangle. Residents started coming forward with horror stories like the family who'd been denied approval for a wheelchair ramp because it didn't meet aesthetic standards, or the couple who'd been threatened with liens unless they repainted their shutters a slightly lighter shade of beige. I helped where I could. Calvin asked me to audit the HOA's old email archives. I spent 2 weekends combing through thousands of messages, most of them dull, but occasionally I'd stumble on something that made my stomach turn. One thread discussed target properties that lowered neighborhood appeal. The list included homes owned by people on fixed incomes, single mothers, and 2 families who had recently immigrated. The emails weren't just petty, they were discriminatory. I flagged everything and sent it to Pike. A week later, I got another call. We're adding charges, he said. Housing discrimination. It's harder to prove, but the emails are damning. We'll be contacting the families involved. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my backyard, staring at the shed. The busted door had been replaced, the siding repainted, and a motion sensor light now clicked on at the slightest movement. But it still felt like a crime scene. Not because of the damage, but because of what it represented. The power they thought they had. The ease with which they wielded it. The criminal trial began in early spring. The courtroom was larger this time. An actual jury. Press in the back row. Pike opened with a timeline of events that stretched across a whiteboard like a spiderweb. He laid out the fake inspections, the fabricated complaint forms, the shadow accounts, and the discriminatory enforcement patterns. I was called to the stand on the second day. I didn't dress up, just wore what I always wore. I didn't want to look like some polished victim. I wanted them to see me as I was, tired, overworked, and completely unwilling to be pushed around. Pike led me through the events, the break-in, the damage, the false justifications. Then he handed me a printout of that email Candace had written about me. I read it aloud, voice steady. She's a nurse. She doesn't have time to fight us in court. The defense attorney objected, claimed it was editorializing. The judge overruled him. Later, Pike showed the jury a spreadsheet of diverted funds. One column showed names. The other showed amounts. Mine was their 2 fines totaling $300. But others had paid much more. At one point, an elderly man stood up from the gallery and asked to speak. The judge refused, but the moment left a crack in the atmosphere. People weren't just watching, they were reliving their own stories. By day 4, the defense was floundering. Naomi had already flipped, agreeing to testify against Candace and Gerald in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony was brutal. She admitted to forging signatures, manipulating vote counts, and even redacting emails before releasing records to residents. They said it was about maintaining standards, she told the court. But it was about control. Candace wanted to be queen of the neighborhood. The jury took less than 2 days. All 3 were convicted. Candace got 4 years. Gerald got 3.5. Naomi got 18 months, with parole eligibility after 6. It wasn't just satisfying, it was seismic. The entire town took notice. The reporter who'd first covered my case ran a follow-up titled, Maple Hollow Cleans House. Residents from other subdivisions started contacting Calvin, asking how they could audit their own HOAs. A few even asked if I'd help them get started. I agreed. Quietly. I wasn't out for revenge anymore. I was after something bigger. Accountability. Fairness. The right of people to live in peace without being bullied by someone with a laminated badge and a misplaced sense of authority. One afternoon, I took my daughter to the park. As we passed another neighborhood, I saw a familiar sign. HOA rules strictly enforced. It was bolted to a fence, faded and crooked. I pulled out my phone and took a photo. Later that evening, I emailed it to Calvin with a subject line that read, "Starting to itch again." His reply came quickly. "Let's talk." 2 months after the convictions, Maple Hollow looked different, calmer, yes, but alert in a way it hadn't been before. People walked their dogs with their heads up now. Neighbors who used to keep to themselves chatted in driveways. The air had shifted. The fear was gone, but the memory of it wasn't. And none of us wanted to forget what it had taken to get here. I was sitting on my porch one evening, organizing some backlogged medical notes, when Calvin walked up with a folder under his arm and a look that said he hadn't come to talk about lawn care. "We've got something weird," he said, setting the folder down on the patio table. New management company flagged it. Inside were copies of maintenance invoices, some recent, others dating back almost 2 years. They were billed to a company called Horizon Groundskeeping. Each invoice looked clean, professional, but something was off. I flipped through them, then paused. "Why are these all the exact same amount?" "Exactly," Calvin said. "Every month. $1,500. No fluctuation. No itemized labor. No supply cost changes. Always $1,500. Who owns Horizon?" "That's the thing. The address listed on the invoices? It's a P.O. box in a strip mall next to a vape shop." I raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. No business license on file?" "Bingo. And here's the kicker: we pulled the HOA's vendor forms from last year. The contact listed for Horizon Groundskeeping? Gerald. Full name. Home phone." I leaned back in my chair, the weight of it all pressing against my spine. "They created a fake landscaping company," I said quietly, "and paid themselves out of HOA funds. Looks that way. And we already know they used HOA money to buy supplies that never made it into the neighborhood. This could tie it all together." We took it straight to the DA's office. Pike wasn't surprised. He brought in a forensic accountant, who confirmed the payments had been listed under routine landscaping and approved without bids or competitive quotes, violating not just HOA bylaws, but state procurement standards. That opened the door to a new investigation, one that went beyond Candace, Gerald, and Naomi, because those checks had required dual signature approvals. And while Gerald had signed off on every one, there was a second name on the documents. Someone from the independent auditing firm that had supposedly reviewed the HOA's books annually. It didn't take long to unravel. Turns out, the auditor, a man named Ellis Moore, had never actually performed a full audit. He'd been paid under the table to rubber stamp the financials, allowing the board to continue their laundering unnoticed. And when the heat ramped up during the civil case, he quietly moved his office to another county. Pike filed for a warrant. Moore was arrested within the week. With the fraud now extending to falsified audits and shell companies, the state attorney general's office got involved. They began reviewing HOA practices across the region, launching a broader task force into oversight failures. Maple Hollow became the poster child for what happens when local governance lacks transparency. But it wasn't over yet. One Saturday, I got a knock on my door. A man I didn't recognize stood on the porch, mid-50s, tin windbreaker, thin-rimmed glasses. His badge was clipped to his belt. "Camilla Dorsey?" he asked. "Depends. Who's asking?" "Special Agent Monroe, State Financial Crimes Bureau. I'd like to talk about a property purchase made by Candace Dillard." He showed me a document, a deed transfer for a 1-acre plot of land just outside town. Bought 6 months before the break-in. Paid in full, cash. "Why me?" "We believe the funds used for the purchase were siphoned from the HOA's emergency reserve account. The account was drained over the course of 3 months. Transfers were disguised as vendor payments to Horizon Groundskeeping." I let out a sharp breath. She used neighborhood emergency funds to buy her own private land? That's our working theory. And here's where it gets more interesting. She filed for a construction permit on that land. Claimed she was building a community rec center. But the plans were never submitted to the county. No inspections. No construction. Nothing. She was planning to sell it later. Most likely. Flip it, claim HOA equity, and walk away clean. The agent handed me a copy of the deed. We've frozen the property. If we can prove the funds were embezzled, the state will seize it and distribute restitution to the HOA. I nodded slowly. Good. Let her dream house turn into a cautionary tale. By the time the next community meeting rolled around, the clubhouse was packed wall to wall. Calvin stood at the front, flanked by the new treasurer, a young guy named Marcus who used to work in compliance for the city's housing department. Calvin cleared his throat. We're introducing a new policy tonight. From now on, all board spending every dollar will be posted online each month. Full transparency. No exceptions. The crowd erupted into applause. And we've set up an oversight committee. 5 volunteers, rotated every quarter. They'll review contracts, inspect vendor work, and flag anything suspicious. More cheers. Then he gestured to me. And we'd like to thank Camilla Dorsey for helping uncover everything. Without her, none of this would have come to light. I didn't stand up. I just nodded. It wasn't about recognition. It was about making sure no one else had to be afraid of their own neighborhood. After the meeting, a woman approached me. New resident. Young, maybe early 30s, pushing a stroller. You're the one who stood up to them, right? I gave a small smile. I filed a lawsuit and installed a few cameras. That's all. She shook her head. No. You reminded people that we don't have to just take it. That night, Calvin called with one last piece of news. Candace took a plea deal on the new charges, he said. She admitted to the land scheme and the fake company. She's forfeiting the property and paying restitution. How much? $82,000. Back to the HOA? Every penny. Plus 5 years probation and a 15-year ban from serving on any residential board or nonprofit. I exhaled. That'll sting. She's also been barred from holding any property management license. I let that settle. It wasn't revenge. It was closure. In the weeks that followed, things settled into a rhythm. Marcus implemented a digital portal where residents could vote on small changes, like seasonal decor or community events. Kids started chalking the sidewalks again. Someone painted murals on the side of the rec center bright blues and oranges, no approval needed. And the shed? I turned it into a workspace. Installed a workbench, new lighting, and even a little coffee station. The broken pieces were gone, but I kept one thing. The old lock, twisted and cut, mounted on a plaque above the door. Not as a reminder of what they did, but of what we did after.